Welcome to the Rising Latterly podcast.
Each episode you will learn something fascinating so you can bring big ideas to your small talk.
Your growth is our growth. Listening to these episodes, subscribing to our weekly newsletter, engaging our posts on social media, and sharing our show with your friends and family is deeply appreciated as we work hard to expand this platform. You can also visit our page at buymeacoffee.com to contribute what you think the show is worth.
To the folks who are taking this step, we can't thank you enough. Look for the link in our show notes for more details about how you can support and follow us.
And now, please enjoy this episode. Through our conversations over the past few weeks with some incredibly insightful people, we've been learning more about how to become compassionate, kinder, and empathetic with ourselves and each other. A strategy we've heard about several times now is to be able to pull from fairy tales, myths, histories, or oral traditions from different cultures and different time periods. That's why we're looking forward to our conversation today. We're joined from Scotland by John Philip Newell, an internationally acclaimed spiritual teacher and author of several books, including his latest one, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul. What makes John Philip fascinating is how he brilliantly ties in the Celtic wisdom into how we can all live more awakened lives. While on the surface, the word Celtic might immediately conjure up religion, the church, and Christianity, I want to be very clear that this conversation will focus more on some of the key characters who pushed the Celtic tradition forward in the face of challenges that the established church consistently put in front of them. If this book is about religion, it's really about the religion to treat the earth and each other as sacred. And from my outside perspective, while reading this book, I felt as if the Celtics were just like the hippies. And I mean that with all due respect. This is about love. This is about seeing the light in each other. This is about being able to pull from different characters and their archetypes as you try to engage in more caring conversations with the people you surround yourself with. And this is about an alternative way of thinking about your strictly held beliefs established by the church or by any other strict religion you might be following unconsciously. So John Philip, thank you for taking time and welcome to the Rising Latterly podcast.
Thank you, Arjun. Very good to be with you. And Jay.
Thank you. Great to have you, John Philip.
It's a privilege, and we never take these interactions for granted. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about in your new book, and we'll definitely dive into it. But we wanted to start with a little bit about you. So can you tell us a little bit about your childhood, where you grew up, what life was like at that time, and then maybe highlight a few of the key pit stops along your journey that's gotten you to this point?
Yes. Well, I'm a bit of a mid-Atlantic confusion. My father was from Ireland, but he and my mother, who is Scottish, they met in Canada. So I was, in fact, born in Canada, although most of my education has been on this side of the Atlantic. So a sort of Irish, Scottish, Canadian blend. And sometimes people don't quite know where to place me in terms of my accent, and that's because I truly am a mid-Atlantic confusion. But I feel very comfortable on both sides of the Atlantic. Edinburgh here in Scotland is home, but in fact, a lot of my work is in Canada and the United States every year. So I grew up with that wonderful Irish-Scottish combination of parentage. And my father was a minister and was of quite a conservative evangelical tradition in his formation. I always felt that he was enormously bigger than that in his heart. He was a man who I learned from and observed to bring the sort of essence of his being to encounter the essence of the other. So even though that religious system had some pretty tight and hard boundaries to it doctrinally, what I sort of received from my father and what I really took from that more evangelical tradition was more of an awareness of the heart. And it's interesting for me, looking back on some of the really important interspiritual or interfaith relationships that have been dear to me over the years, I realized that what I'm always doing when I meet another from a so-called other tradition or across these so-called other boundaries that religion and culture and nationhood has often created. I find that what I'm doing is being attentive to the heart of the other, which is always, that's not to downplay the importance of thought and articulation, but it's to say that there is, I believe, that deeper essence in one another, and what in the book I speak of as the sacred essence of the other.
Right.
So I was reared in that sort of religious context in Canada, and then I came to study theology here in Edinburgh in the 1970s, and I remember very clearly, as a young man in my 20s, hearing George MacLeod speak publicly. George MacLeod was in his 80s at that stage. He was a bit of a legend in Scotland, a Church of Scotland minister. And I heard him speak about the sacredness of the earth, and I heard him speak about nonviolence as the way of true relationship between us as peoples, but also as nations and communities and races. And when I was listening to him that first time that I heard him, I had this coming home experience. I realized this man is giving voice to what I know at a deep level, but I had never heard it articulated so clearly, so powerfully. And I made a decision at that point in my life when I first heard George MacLeod. I realized I need somehow to become close to this man. I need to find an opportunity to get to know him and to receive from him. And that was what sort of the universe sort of gave me in the few years after that. So that was an enormous influence in my life. And it was a point at which I really began to put together the vision and the articulation of spirituality with a reverence for the earth and for a more conscious moving to be in relationship with the sacred heart of every human being and every creature.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I know that in the book you touch on George and your experience back when you met him in the late 70s, and the character that the archetype that he represents is sacred compassion.
Yes.
Right. He showed what compassion means when you actually bring your full heart into something. I thought that was pretty fascinating.
Yes, it's I love words, and I love to try to understand the origin of words. And I remember a number of years ago being so delighted to make a connection between the word compassion and the word compass. And by compass, I'm meaning those mathematical instruments that some of us still remember being trained to use in primary school, where you place one point of the compass on one place, and then you put the other on the other place, and you can form a circle connecting them. And so compassion, both in terms of origin of the word, but in meaning, is about me bringing the heart of my being to be in relationship to the heart of your being, and to allow that awareness of connection between the heart of my being and the heart of your being to guide my actions, to guide how I think about you, how I act in relation to you, and to find that sense of connection, not only between those we know and love, but those on the other side of these so-called boundaries that have been created to often divide us.
Absolutely. I'm curious, when you were studying theology back in the 1970s and these ideas really started to resonate with you, Were you sharing them with other students that may have been a little bit more conservative minded? Was there any friction as you started to share these new ways of thinking about sacredness and connection with the people around you that were maybe on a different train of thought?
Yes. Sorry, Jay. We had a bit of bad connection there, but I think I heard what you were saying about how the context of studying theology and whether some of this vision of the sacredness at the heart of the other created any sort of friction or tension. I mean, absolutely.
Mm.
And one of the things that I point to in this book, and speaking about these 9 sort of main prophetic characters in the Celtic stream, is that nearly all of them have been accused of heresy,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
have literally been sort of pushed out of Christianity as it was defined, especially in the 4th century and following. And the 4th century was a critical time of development in the Christian tradition, because it was in the 4th century that Christianity got into bed with empire. It's understandable the attraction to coming within the compass of empire, because before that they had been a sort of persecuted minority in the Roman Empire. So there was a sort of seduction, I suppose, to that relationship. But what began to happen from the 4th century following in so much Western Christianity, the church really began to articulate doctrines that were somewhat convenient to empire. And one of the first major articulations of belief that we find in the 4th century is a doctrine that was referred to as the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, in which it was said that a distant creator fashioned the earth and the universe out of nothing. And Irenaeus, the Celtic teacher, as early as the 2nd century, anticipating some of that thinking, said, but creation doesn't come out of nothing. Creation, he said, comes out of the very womb of the divine. And he uses a word that is still shocking to our dualistic ears, I think, when he says creation, the earth comes out of the substance of the divine, which has enormous implications. It's to say that this stuff, the stuff of my body, the stuff of your body, the stuff of the body of the earth, the bodies of those who are suffering and hungry today, these are sacred bodies. And what we do to one another in relationship, how we handle one another in relationship, how we care for the physical needs of those who are suffering and hungry, how we care for the body of the earth. This is at the very heart of a true spirituality in my thinking, and it is what comes across again and again in these great teachers over the centuries. So Christianity, as we know it, and as it was formed in the 4th century, especially shaped in the 4th century and following, began to articulate sort of convenient truths to empire. And whether we're speaking of the Roman Empire, or whether we're speaking about the British Empire or the American Empire, religion has often condoned what empire wants to do to matter, or how it wants to treat the resources of the earth. And there are other doctrines at that critical point in time that illustrate what the relationship is going to be between so much Western Christianity and power.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, another doctrine I think we can get into is original sin. But before we get there, just on George MacLeod for 1 second, I was going to pull from your book something that you had written. You mentioned he taught the holiness of wholeness. holiness, he said, is essentially about healthiness. It's about healthy relationship with the earth and with each other. The words holy and whole are derived from the same root, the Middle English word hail, which means health. I thought that was great in terms of just understanding like etymology and understanding the root of some of these words that we use every single day and how they come together. So just in terms of compassion and George as a character, thought that was worth mentioning.
Yes, absolutely. And George himself was a great one to love words and to try to go back to the origin of words, because the word holy has so often suggested almost like an otherworldliness, whereas for George and so much in this Celtic stream that I am drawing from and see myself as standing in terms of how I long to live and to see the earth and to see others. Holiness is not about disengaging with the matter of life. One of the other phrases that George MacLeod used that I loved was matter matters.
Right.
Because what we do to matter is what we're doing to the sacred. And very importantly for someone like George MacLeod, and I was so keen to include a chapter on George MacLeod in this book, because he really very clearly grounds a lot of the vision of this ancient tradition. He grounds it in the very practical work of compassion. And for him, wholeness, healthiness, holiness, it relates also to the life of our nation and of our nations, doing what we can to bring our nationhood back into a relationship with the sacredness of the earth, and the sacredness not just of the people of our nation, but the people of every nation. And therefore, wholeness, compassion, is once again about bringing the center of our being into relationship with the center of the people of other nations, and to allow that to guide our policies, instead of thinking that we can be well or we can be whole just by looking after ourselves and neglecting other races, other nations, or other species.
Right.
Yeah, I think otherizing divinity and feeling a sense of severance from other life on the planet, that dynamic is related to each other. You can see how 2,000 years ago, when we didn't understand evolution, when we didn't understand the history of the earth as well as we do, people could believe something like there was some kind of divine energy out there that airdropped us humans, made complete onto the planet, and gave us this dominion. But we've come so far in terms of our scientific knowledge, and it seems that the pagan traditions, the Celtic traditions, they kind of had an intuition that was actually much more aligned with modern science than Christianity did.
Yeah, I think that part of what I'm calling us to in this book is to get in touch with some of our deepest natural knowing. I in the book I give some examples of how we know the sacredness of the newborn child when we hold the child in our arms. I mean, I consider the births of my 4 children as the most sacred moments in my life. In their face, I could see something of the light from which we and all things have come. In their skin, I could smell something of the freshness of life's origins. And I think many of us have these deep knowing experiences in relation to one another, in relation to the earth. And this knowing is for me to be reverenced, it's to be built on. So our religious traditions, our great spiritual traditions, I believe, are trying to give voice to and articulation to that deep knowing. And the tragedy of a lot of religious expression is that it sometimes tried to set itself up as offering a knowledge, sort of depositing it from above, dispensing it from above, saying, let us tell you about truth, instead of finding ways to radically affirm what is already in the heart of the listener.
And relative to just being able to see that deep natural knowing or that flow of the divine, you mentioned in the book, there's a gentleman by the name of John Scotus Erigena. I could be pronouncing that wrong, but he's another character or archetype that you had brought forth in the book, and he awakens us to look for that flow of the divine deep that you're kind of talking about right now.
Yes, and I mean we're on a bit of a roll in terms of etymology, because the John Scotus Erigena, he also loved to play with words, and one of the words that he played with was the word theos, Theos, the transliteration from the Greek for God. And he says theos is derived from the verb theo, which means to flow. So God, he said, is the one who flows through all things, like the subterranean flow of light that is deep in matter and deep in everything that has being. And he says, if that flow of the divine deep in all things were somehow dammed up or stopped, then everything would cease to exist. So the flow of the divine is not only in some people, of certain religions or certain races or certain sexual orientations, or the list goes on and on. That flow is right at the heart of everything that has being. So again, the relationship with the sacred is not something that we need to invoke from afar, as it were. It's something that we need to, at a deeper level, let go to. It's already deep within us. And Kenneth White, the last sort of Celtic prophet that I deal with in the book, sort of builds on Erigena, and he says God is not only the flow, God is the glow flow that is deep within all things. And I like to build even further on that play of words and say, God is not only the flow, God is not only the glow flow, but we need to let go to the glow flow.
Nice.
I really like that. I know we've talked a little bit about how Christianity fell under imperial order, and now we've talked about a little bit about the differences in the ideas between maybe a conservative Christian view of the world and a Celtic vision of the world. I'm wondering if you can share with us and our listeners how the Celtics conceptualize Christ, because Christ, I actually was raised Catholic, so Christ was a person I had heard a lot about growing up, and he's so central to the Christian vision of the world. And I think for listeners that maybe have that figure in their life, in their psyche, hearing about how the Celtics thought of him and sort of him sitting at the intersection between the divine and the material may be of interest.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. That's a really important question. I appreciate you bringing it up, because it is an important question that I encounter among many listeners. What is the role of Christ in this Celtic Christian stream of wisdom? And if I could maybe just back up slightly, this 9th century teacher that we've been speaking about, John Scotus Erigena, one of the things he says is that we suffer from soul forgetfulness. He says we have forgotten who we are, made of God, made of the sacred, and we've forgotten the essence of the other. We've forgotten that flow of the divine that is deep within all things. So he speaks about us living in a state of forgetfulness. And the more we forget, the more we're likely not to treat the other and ourselves and the earth as sacred. So that's part of the context, the sense of soul forgetfulness. And someone like Erigena goes on to say that Christ is our memory. That's the word he uses. He also speaks sometimes as Christ as our revelation. And the word revelation comes from the Latin root revelare, which just means to lift the veil. So he sees Christ not as embodying a truth that is foreign to us, but he rather sees Christ as sort of lifting the veil to show us the sacredness that is at the heart of our being and all being. So in that sense, he is our memory. And this is so radically different from the Christ figure or the doctrines about Christ that come down in once again in a lot of our Western Christian history from the 4th century onwards. Because in most of that teaching, Christ is seen as essentially foreign to what is deepest in us. And this takes us back, Arjun, to the doctrine of original sin that we touched on earlier. And this is a doctrine that has been used to teach that what is deepest in us, and in that sense, what is most original in us, is opposed to God rather than of God.
Right.
So I think this, for me, this is one of the most important contributions of the Celtic stream to the rest of the Christian stream. I think that one of the wisdoms that this tradition offers us is that a love of the Christ figure or the love of the Christ mystery equals, in my mind, a love of the light that is at the heart of your being and at the heart of all being. So, and so much Christianity has wanted to teach in its doctrines that a love of Christ is somehow essentially foreign to what is at the very heart of my being or at the heart of your being. I have a lovely memory that's come to me about giving a talk in Virginia, an interspiritual, interfaith talk. And there was a rabbi, an imam, and I was there as the Christian teacher. I mean, it sounds like the beginning of a joke, doesn't it? So we were asked at one point, the dialogue sort of opened up and people were able to ask questions from the floor. And someone asked us if we would speak about the doctrine of original sin. And this, of course, is a Christian problem. This is not a Jewish problem. It's not a Muslim problem. Both of those traditions begin by remembering that we are made of God, that we're made in the image of God. But the rabbi was the first to respond, and he said, original sin. He said, that to most Jews would mean that was a really original sin. That was a really creative sin. And at that moment, I thought, thank God for interfaith dialogue. I mean, here this rabbi has got a room full of Christians laughing about this absurd doctrine of original sin. And I say absurd, and I'm also prepared to use the word perverted. This is a perverted teaching. One only has to hold a newborn child in your arms to know that this is a sick doctrine. And again, it's been used by empire from the 4th century onwards to make it very convenient not to treat everyone as essentially holy, as essentially sacred.
Yeah, absolutely. As someone growing up under that doctrine, I have no ill will towards my parents. We've all sort of moved away from Catholicism in some respect in recent years, but it's an idea that they inherited from their parents and their parents inherited from their parents. And you kind of, after reading your book, I realized how old these ideas are, and it takes me back to that Carl Jung line, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. It's something that we've been living with for so long. But even as a kid, I remember when we were first taught that in CCD, that was like the one idea that I had the hardest time wrapping my head around, because it just felt so counterintuitive to the way I wanted to feel about myself, to the way I felt about others that had not been baptized, the way I felt about, my brother and my family. And I think perverted is an accurate word, because to teach someone that they come into this world inherently bad or inherently stained is just psychologically damaging. And I think it makes people more pliable, which, going all the way back to the empire, is, I think, where they wanted people to be psychologically.
Yeah. Yes, much more dependent on being told what truth is and told how to behave. But it is a psychologically damaging teaching, I believe. I mean, if you tell a child that she is ugly, that she's stupid, that she doesn't know anything, at some level the child starts believing that statement. And I think that many of us have lived under that self doubt, and I think there's a great teacher, a spiritual teacher in California named Matthew Fox, and he 25, maybe 30 years ago, wrote a seminal work called Original Blessing, in which he's really saying, no, not original sin, original blessedness, original sacredness. And interestingly, one of the other phrases that Matthew has developed, in part because there's often quite a reaction, if you've been trained in the Roman Catholic or sort of Reformed Protestant traditions, if you hear someone challenging the doctrine of original sin, they sometimes think you're being naive and saying, that we're all sort of perfect, or that there isn't a place to prophetically denounce what is false. And this certainly isn't true of the 9 teachers that I draw from. I mean, they are very prophetic often about denouncing our falseness or our capacity for terrible wrong. But one of the subsequent phrases that someone like Matthew Fox has developed is that we could speak about original woundedness, that the world that we come into is a wounded world. The nations that we're born into are wounded nations. Our families carry wounds, generational wounds often. So in the Celtic world, very importantly, grace and nature are not seen as opposed to each other. So that in a lot of Christian teaching, it's been said, that our nature is sinful, and that grace is given to somehow change our nature, or grace is given in opposition to what is deepest in our nature. But in the Celtic Christian tradition, again, someone like Reawakening, he says that grace is the gift, nature is the gift of being, and our being is essentially sacred. And grace, he says, is the gift of well-being. That is, it's given to reconnect us to the sacredness of our nature. It's not given to make us something other than natural or somehow more than natural. It's given to make us truly natural. And that's going back to the sort of who is Christ in the Celtic tradition. That's one of the other phrases that we hear, that Christ is the truly natural one, or again, not the other than natural one, or the more than natural one. He's seen as the one who shows us what our true nature is.
Yeah, I mean, from your book, just the idea that the energy that's stirring inside of us is the same energy that's stirring the universe. That's one way to think about it. And then a concept around the original sin that I was thinking about. I mean, when you start to talk about original sin, you start to marginalize people, you start to maybe marginalize yourself. I think from there, a lot of fear can start to come up. And so that's why you see fear in society. You see people having fear of doing things. I think when you think about original sin and you're telling someone that you're digging a hole for these people as soon as they're born. And it's like, no wonder people are having so many like psychological problems these days, because they've been having this burden and this weight for their entire life, thinking that original sin was the doctrine to believe. What are your thoughts on fear and how original sin ties into that?
Yes, I think that the fear of the so-called other is a feature of so many of the places of division in our world, and whether that's the fear of another religion, or the fear of another race, or the fear of another sexual orientation, or
How about the fear of just being a living being yourself from nature? Like you could be afraid of just being a creature.
yes, that's right. And especially if if that essence of the nature is being described as essentially opposed to the sacred, or as essentially sinful, then it has all sorts of repercussions in terms of, well, I'm not going to trust my deepest energies, and this has wreaked havoc in the realm of sexual energy, for instance, and it's no coincidence that the practice of celibacy in Western Christianity for priests began to be the norm in the 4th century, when Christianity becomes the religion of empire and begins to put forward doctrines like the doctrine of original sin, because then the path of holiness is seen as a denial of those deepest energies of our being,
Right.
rather than seeing the deepest energies of our being, including our yearning, our deep sexual yearnings for intimacy and oneness, instead of seeing these as having a root in the divine and related to the essential oneness and the essential interrelatedness of all things, those sexual energies began to be interpreted as sinful, as evil, as selfish, instead of part of the relational nature of our being.
I'd be curious if you agree with this analysis, John Philip, but it sort of seems like under imperial Christianity, people were made to feel like every other love or desire or drive they had needed to be subordinated under their love for God. So really there was just one true love, and then everything else was of the material world, was of much less consequence, if any consequence at all. And I think what feels right about the Celtic traditions is that it's a much more integrated approach to love. It's you celebrate the love you have for your parents and your friends and your romantic partners in the same way that you celebrate the love for the divine. There's no severance there. And you think about how much subordinating all those natural drives as a creature underneath that one love for God, how much people get cut off from themselves, because life is a biological experience. Life is a human experience. It's kind of defined by our relationships with each other here on the earth. And when all of that goes away, all of that gets pressed down to the shadow. It's a sliver of the experience that you could have if you were to embrace love in all its capacity.
Yes, absolutely. One of the chapters in the book, chapter 7, focuses on the vision, the teachings of a French scientist, mystic, priest, Teilhard de Chardin, and Teilhard's journey is a fascinating one. His biography, because he grew up in a very traditional French Roman Catholic family. But he had this very sharp sense, and I think it is the child's knowing, a great love for the light that he saw shining deep in all things. And he begins to not only sort of love this light, or knows that he loves this light, but he finds himself wanting to adore or almost worship this light that is deep within the body of the earth and deep within all things. And he has a critical sort of turning point in his young adulthood, when he fears that what he's slipping into is pantheism, this belief that everything is God, and what he comes to see is that uh, this attraction, this wanting to adore and even worship the light that is in all things, is an adoring of the light of the divine that is deep within all things, within you, within me, within everything that has being. And he comes out of this realization saying, before he thought there were two paths to choose, either love of God or love of the earth. And he now comes to see that it's a third path has opened up, and that is a loving of God in and through the earth and in and through humanity. And I think that this is essentially very close to the heart of the wisdom of Jesus when he is calling us to love our neighbor as ourself, and really he's taking that teaching and pushing it into very radical form when he says, we're even to love our enemy as ourself. And this is about again recovering a sense of the sacred at the heart of all, and knowing that what we do, what I do to you is what I do to God. It's not a sort of a sacred presence out there that is sort of limitedly transcendent. It's the immanent presence of the divine within one another and within the earth.
Yeah, and to that point, this idea that we've been talking about of just getting deeper with the natural knowing and deeper just understanding where the light comes from. I love how in the book you write about how imagination is the pathway into deeper knowing, and how it's a bridge to the future, and how it opens up our eyes to a new way of living that we haven't experienced yet. So I think imagination is something that more people should start to explore. So let's talk about that a little bit, because in the Celtic world, it's a big deal. It's a faculty of knowing, as you write in the book, and it's a way of remembering. There's a spirit to imagination that I think we should be talking about.
Yeah, to so many of these teachers historically, to be made in the image of God is to be made in the image of the imagination, or it's to be made of God is to be made of imagination. And I love what someone like Thomas Berry, the eco-theologian of in the 20th century, said. He said, "The universe is so amazing, it must have been dreamt into being." And then he goes on to say, and we are in such a mess, ecologically, right, religiously, societally. We're in such a mess, he says, we need to dream the way forward. We need to allow ourselves to imagine ways of being in relationship with one another and with the earth that we haven't known anything of before. So to access the imagination as an essential part of the way forward it's a very beautiful and powerful and inspiring aspect of this stream of wisdom. It also means, I think, really importantly, that we don't get stuck in a position or one articulation of truth, because the reality of the universe is that everything just keeps unfolding, and anything that isn't evolving, unfolding, further becoming is essentially finished.
Right.
And this is the way of true and most beautiful relationship, that it's not a static reality. It is a forever unfolding and forever deepening encounter between the mystery of my being and the mystery of the other. I think that's why the child is so celebrated in so many great spiritual traditions, including the way Jesus speaks about the child, because in our childhood we haven't yet been inhibited to the extreme extent as what our education and culture and religion has often tried to do, to put a lid on our imagination.
Exactly. And this idea that imagination actually is something that allows you to have conviction in what you're doing. It allows you to have the idea of like, okay, I know what's false and I know what isn't, and I'm going to like be able to resist what is false through my imagination. And I know the character you had mentioned, or the person you had mentioned, was Alexander John Scott. And the reason I'm talking about him so much right now is because from your book, I'm going to read something I think that will resonate with a lot of people. Like Alexander, we will sometimes feel like lone voices, nor can we be sure that our work will ever succeed in bringing about the changes we hope for. The work must rest primarily on the integrity of the vision, as well as the certainty that what we are calling for is a truth that belongs to not only the human soul, but our soul. And when I read that, I mean, it really struck me because I think of entrepreneurs. I think of anyone who is building something right now. You know, they're going through their process, they're going through their iterations. It may feel like you're the only one in the world that's doing it. It's you against the world at times. And so the reason I'm bringing that up is because, again, in the future, for me to be able to have a caring conversation with somebody, there may be a builder out there that wants to, you know, ask us, like Jay and I, how we're building the podcast. And in that conversation, I might be able to say, like, hey, you have a little Alexander John Scott in you, and be able to pull from some of this Celtic wisdom and just be able to relate to him or her a little bit better. So Alexander John Scott, to me, was one of the fascinating people in your book because it just resonated with where I am personally in my personal journey right now.
Yeah, and I think I say a little in the book about my own relationship with Alexander Scott, this 19th century heretic, as he was called in Scotland, who, as a very young man, was deposed, sort of thrown out of the church ministry unanimously by the Church of Scotland's highest court, and including his own father was in the court. And I mean, how do you deal with that sort of rejection from the religion of your birth and the religion of your family? So this fascinating young man who began to see very clearly that to be made in the image of God is to be made in the image of the great imaginer, and that can be a challenging one, I think, in terms of how we live it out, because I think very importantly, not only in someone like Scott, but in many of these other great teachers, there's a balancing between what I hear in my soul, or what I think I'm beginning to hear in my soul, and testing that out by me showing to you what is beginning to unfold in my soul, showing it to people who believe in us enough to say, you know, John Philip, who do you think you're kidding? I mean, this sounds a fairly convenient idea, you know, rather than truth. I think it always challenges. It always makes us uncomfortable. It always pushes us beyond the boundaries that we've been living in. So this isn't convenient imagination. This isn't just sort of subjectivity. It's about being willing to try to utter what we haven't yet known, and doing that, expressing that as uninhibitedly as we can to people that we trust and people around us who love us enough to challenge us. So my particular relationship with Scott that has sort of made him particularly dear to me is that I did my PhD research on Alexander John Scott, and I nearly wasn't allowed to do it because he hadn't been a writer. He had been a great teacher, and he influenced the students and people who were around him, but he wasn't committed to published writings, which meant that I didn't have much written material to go on.
Nothing to source.
That's right. Yes. So I found a lot of information on him through personal letters because he was very close to people like Frederick Chopin and Dickens, Charles Dickens,
Wow.
and all sorts of interesting leading thinkers in the 19th century he was close to. And of course, these people have vast collections of letters in national libraries and university libraries around Britain. So a lot of his thinking I was able to access in and through personal letters, which was a wonderful way to construct theology. And by the end of the 3 years of research, I was having long conversations with him in my dreams at night, and I think Scott would have approved of that, because the dream world is also part of imagination. It's part that our dreams come up from the unconscious. They come up from that place where everything is essentially one. And I think it's worth accessing those expressions of the imagination that come up from deep within us, as long as we keep opening ourselves to the tension of the inner and the outer, and what's happening in my soul, what's happening in your soul and other souls. It's never just a matter of getting lost in one's own unconscious, or getting lost in one's own imagination, because I think that can actually lead us into a world of madness if we don't keep testing, integrating what's happening within us with what's happening in each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of need to concretize it in the outer world. I think there's a connection there with the importance of ritual as well. Yeah, then that theme came up, and I know we're almost at the top of the hour, but I'm just wondering, John Philip, if you carry out any of these traditional Celtic rituals in your own life. There's so many great ones in the book. We don't have time to go through them, but I'm wondering if you've brought them into your routine.
Yeah, one of the things I do every year is to lead international pilgrimage weeks on the island of Iona in the Hebrides.
Oh, cool.
And ritual is a really important part of what we do there, because I think that teaching is one thing, sort of engaging with the mind is one thing, but I think spiritual practice and meditation, but also simple ritual, is an important way of almost playing ourselves into more consciousness. And again, I've mentioned Thomas Berry, and one of the things that he encouraged was the use of ritual. And it's not as if we have to have everything sort of figured out before we symbolize through ritual. I think often it's the other way around, that it's actually when we begin to play with ritual, especially around rituals that access the elements of earth, air, fire, and water, that it is in and through simple rituals of using fire, for instance. And one of the rituals that we use every time on Iona is a simple ritual of having a fire, a candle or some candles in the center of a circle, and we take it in turn during one of these simple rituals just to go up and place our hands over the fire, and then place it to our eyes, and allow this simple ritual to say, to give expression to our desire to see the light of the divine in one another and in all things. And then we place our hand back over the fire again, and the second time we place it up to our heart. And it's about knowing the light of the divine deep within us, as well as seeing it in one another. These are utterly simple rituals, and I think
Hindus do it too.
Absolutely. I mean, I should have said that that ritual was inspired in me, or the use of it was inspired in me when I experienced something very similar in an Indian temple years ago. I think these simple rituals, these elemental rituals, can be found in all of the great traditions, because there's something utterly simple and utterly profound. I think that so many of us in the Christian household and the Christian tradition are just longing to be freed from the verbiage of just too many words and too much getting stuck up here.
Yeah.
And too much sort of about assenting to certain doctrines and teachings, instead of allowing the elements of earth, air, fire, and water to lead us back into relationship with the mystery of the earth and the mystery that all of us are composed of: earth, air, fire, and water.
Beautiful.
On that, it's hard not to add a new word, actually. I learned it in your book. So a pilgrimage without an unknown destination is called a peregrination. Yes. And so as we all have this, think about the conversation we just had, and we think about where we are in our own journeys, I feel like there's an awakening taking place across the globe, where people are kind of getting rid of some of their strictly held beliefs. And so if you're one of those people that wants to start to explore and you don't have a destination in mind, the new word for you is peregrination.
Yes, absolutely. It's this, part of peregrination in the early Celtic centuries. There was a practice sometimes of getting into a boat without a rudder and basically being blown, to one's place of resurrection. So peregrination was in part about finding one's place of resurrection, finding one's place of new beginnings. And I so love what Carl Jung observed about resurrection. He said, resurrection is not about resuscitation. It's not about sort of bringing to life again what we've already known. It's about a radical new beginning, which we couldn't have even imagined. Again, the place of the imagination opening to what we haven't yet known, and seeing that this may be our place of new beginnings.
That's a wonderful note to end on.
So again, the book is called Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul. There are more stories in here, including, the story of John Muir. That might be interesting to people. But before we wrap up, John Philip, one last question for you. If you could be any animal, what animal would you be and why?
I would be a wolf. Through some of my sort of shamanic connections, especially with Native American teachers, the wolf apparently is my animal.
Oh wow!
And I think that one of the things I so love about the wolf, and this became clear to me in relationship with a native teacher. Wolves are often seen as sort of solitary animals, and I am someone who loves solitude. I cherish solitude, times alone, to write and to clarify. But this native teacher also very importantly reminded me, and this was part of the gift for me of coming into association with the wolf in me, is that the wolf is very much part of community, part of a pack. And the lone wolf, in a sense, goes ahead to explore the unknown territory for the pack. And I think that's what we can be in some of our spiritual work, our spiritual imaginings, our spiritual explorations. In a sense, we're playing a role for the rest of the tribe, or the rest of the pack, or the rest of the community.
It's beautiful.
It's a wonderful answer.
It's been great being with you both.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your contribution. I know Jay and I learned a lot, and we cannot wait for the world to hear this.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week.
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglatterly.com.
Thank you.